tuturor, îmi cer scuze că n-am început cu asta și o să începem să lăsăm pe dumnealui să vorbească. Prima temă majoră, criteriile pentru a considera că o teorie este mai probabilă decât altă teorie. Problema ridicată de întrebările 41, 44 și 63, anume întrebări puse de Vasile Sambor, Brădean Sergiu și Simona Badia.
Two kinds of ways in which we explain phenomena. The first way is by the method of scientific explanation. Scientific explanation is explaining a phenomenon in terms of some law of nature and some initial conditions. To take a rather simple example, suppose there is a lump of solid stuff which is heated, and we want to know, and it expanded, and we want to know why it expanded, then we will ask for an explanation of what laws were determining initial conditions to cause it to expand. The explanation is that this solid is iron, and that and it has been heated, and that there is a law of nature that all iron, when heated, expands. That is a very trivial example, but all scientific explanation has this pattern. For example, when Newton explained the motion of the moon and the motion of the planets and why bodies fall to earth when we let go of them on Earth, the explanation is that they were originally in a certain condition and Newton's three laws operated. Thus, he explained the motion of the moon by the initial position at some earlier time of the moon and of the Earth and of the sun, and his three laws of motion and his law of gravitational attraction. That is not the only way of explaining phenomena. We often explain phenomena not in terms of laws of nature and initial conditions, but in terms of the action of agents, people who produce some result because they have a purpose for doing so and a belief that the means they are using will produce that result, and they have the power to use the means in order to produce that result. So there are three components of what I call a personal explanation. A person, the person's powers to move their hands in various ways, a person's goal, his purpose, for example, to call attention to what he is saying, and a belief that by moving the hand, he will call attention to it. Three components of personal explanation. Personal explanation, we explain some phenomena as brought about by a person in order to fulfill some purpose. If I wave my hand in order to draw attention to what I am saying, you explain me moving my hand because I sought to draw attention to what I am saying. Components of the personal explanation are a purpose, to draw attention to what I am saying, a power to wave my hand, a belief that by waving my hand, I will draw attention to what I am saying. In both kinds of explanation, a hypothesis which we put forward for explaining the explanation is probable insofar as three conditions are satisfied, and you will find those on the handout which I provided for you. Our criteria for how probable an purported explanation is of certain phenomena. I call the purported explanation H and the phenomena E. So they are criteria for when E makes H probable. Evidence E makes a hypothesis H probable insofar as, firstly, if H is true, then it is probable you would find E. Secondly, if H is not true, it is not probable that you would find E. And thirdly, H is a simple hypothesis. For example, if we explain the motion of the moon by the evidence of where it was at a certain condition and the hypothesis that Newton's laws operate on, then it follows from H, the hypothesis that Newton's laws operate, that we would find that E, viz., if it is in a certain condition earlier, then now this it will be in its present position. This is my first condition, that given the truth of the hypothesis, in other words, if the hypothesis were true, then you would find this evidence that the moon has moved in this way. Second criterion is that if H is false, it is not probable that you would find E. Example, if Newton's laws were not operative, if there was some other true theory or no theory at all of how the moon moves, then it's not at all probable that it would be where it is. That is not enough, because there will always be an infinite number of possible hypotheses which satisfy the first two criteria. You could always imagine some quite crazy hypothesis, which is such that it makes probable that you would find E and not probable that you wouldn't find E. And yet the hypothesis is so complicated as not to be plausible. You can understand this if you imagine the following very simple example of a scientific hypothesis. Suppose you are studying how some variable y varies with the value of x. You mark on a graph and you observe certain values of x and the corresponding value of y, and you mark on a graph which has y up one axis and x up another axis, the points which you observe. In fact, the points which you observe are ones that for values of x, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the value of y is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And so it looks as if the equation is y equals 2x. Obviously, if you've only marked 6 points on the graph, there are an infinite number of different curves which could pass through those points and nevertheless be totally different in what they predict and in what in their nature of explanation. Are you able to, I should have put this on my handout, but are you able to see this? You can see that if we mark the 6 values of y for values of x which we have observed, that gives us 6 marks on the graph. And an obvious equation to explain these is y equals 2x. There are innumerable different equations of curves which will pass through all these points, and I've marked 2 or 3 of them. They will, all those curvy curves pass through the 6 points. That is how science works. It has only a finite number of data, but there will always be an infinite number of possible explanations which satisfy the first 2 criteria. but not the third one. So unless simplicity is evidence of truth, science is not possible. In the two examples of a scientific, in the explanation which I took, the laws were very simple. Newton's laws are actually very simple, and the most complicated of them is the gravitational law it's the gravitational law. Newton's gravitational law says that the force of gravity between two masses is proportional to the product of those masses and the inverse square of their distance apart. These laws are simple. The gravitational law is simple because it only mentions two properties, a mass of a body and their distance apart, and it only mentions the relations of product of their masses, and square of their distance apart. That is, the only numbers which occur in them are the number 2. What goes for scientific explanation goes also for personal explanation. Personal explanation is simple insofar as it postulates only one person or two persons, and it's simple insofar as it mentions only one or two of the properties of persons, and so on. Now, I could fill in the so on, but you will see on the handout, under just above the line, my detailed account of when a hypothesis is simpler than another hypothesis. That is my answer to your first group of questions, or rather, it's a very short version of that answer, but that is the core of it.
Nu o să trecem la următorul set de întrebări, o să trecem însă la întrebările de la numărul F, care vorbesc despre natura lui Dumnezeu. Natura lui Dumnezeu, dacă este sau nu atemporal și ce înseamnă pentru el să fie omniscient și perfect bun. Și cred că o să revenim mai târziu, dacă va fi timp, la întrebarea pe care ați pus-o mai devreme.
At your handout, under the line, and you will find H. That is the hypothesis we are going to consider, that there is a God. I suggest that the simplest form of this hypothesis is that there exists an essentially eternal, omnipotent person. I'm going to understand eternal by everlasting. That is, in the Christian tradition, there are two different ways of understanding God's relation to time. God is eternal in the sense of being timeless. This means he is outside time, that everything he does and everything that happens to him happens in one timeless instant. If you understand God's being eternal as him being everlasting, this means that he has existed at every instant of past time, exists now, and will exist at every instant of future time, and he will do certain things, will have done certain things a year ago, is doing certain things now, and will do certain other things tomorrow. I am going to understand his eternity as him being everlasting, because that is an easily comprehensible notion, whereas I find it very difficult to make sense of an active and personal God who is outside time. As I defined him, God is an essentially eternal, omnipotent person. Now, to say that he is omnipotent is to say that he can do anything. but what that means is anything logically possible. This is generally agreed in the Christian tradition. And what that means is he cannot do anything the description of which involves a contradiction. Example, God cannot make me exist and not exist at the same time. He can abolish the universe just at an instant. He can create innumerable people on other planets. He can make any difference to the world he chooses, if apart from ones which don't make any sense. If we understand, as I'm understanding, God as being everlasting, it's the consequence that God cannot change the past or alter or affect the past, influence it in any way, because that would make it both one way and a different way at this together. Omnipotent person who can do anything must know what are the things he can do, and therefore he must know everything that is possible in the future and all the necessary truths. And he must know everything that has happened in the past, but he won't know everything that has happened in the future unless he has also decided to do it already. That is God's omniscience. He knows everything that has happened in the past and everything that is a necessary truth, that is to say, something which it makes no sense to deny. In my view, the fundamental truths of morality, that is to say, what is morally good and what is morally bad, are themselves necessary truths. To say something is good must mean that it's something like some standard examples of good things, and it's not like some standard examples of bad things. We all have a concept of moral goodness which we can recognize. Oh, God will know what is good and bad, but to say that something is good, if you really believe something is good, you will have some inclination to do it. Humans don't always do what they believe to be morally good, but that is because they have irrational desires to do bad things. God is not subject to these irrational desires, because if he were, he wouldn't be a simple being. That would be adding something to the definition which I have provided of him. So, not being subject to irrational influences, God, if he recognizes that something is perfectly good, will have a strong reason for doing it, and he will be moved to do it. So God will always do what is good and nothing that is bad, and that is his nature. I have been arguing that all these properties of God, that he is omniscient in a certain sense and that he is perfectly good, follow from his being an essentially eternal, omnipotent being. That is a very simple hypothesis, that there is an essentially eternal, omnipotent person. It postulates one person, not many, in charge of the universe. It postulates the simplest kind of person there could be, because it describes all his properties and the way he is prone to act, simply following from his omnipotence. Postulate an essentially eternal, omnipotent being is a postulate a very simple kind of God. It's simpler than a God who has only limited power. A God who is omnipotent can make a universe of any size, not one or only some size. So the hypothesis that there is a God, explained the way I have explained it, means that it will satisfy criterion 3 for better than any other hypothesis about different kinds of gods or different kinds of beings in charge of the universe. Simpler hypothesis than the hypothesis of polytheism, that there are many gods, or the hypothesis that there is a weak god, or the hypothesis that there is a God who is both good and bad. I hope I have answered the questions concerned with the nature of God. So I've, I hope, answered the questions for believing a theory to be more probable than another, and the questions concerned with the nature of God. And I'm now going on to consider how the hypothesis that there is a God of the kind I have described provides the best explanation of certain phenomena. I'm going on to answer the second group of questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Al doilea grup de întrebări care vorbesc despre cum ne permite utilizarea acestor criterii să evaluăm posibilitatea existenței lui Dumnezeu pe baza dovezilor privind natura generală a universului. Problema ridicată domnul Tamaș, de doamna Tamaș, de Mădălina Frunză în ambele întrebări. Da.
Evidence which I am going to consider for the existence of God is the evidence of the most general phenomena of the universe. I summarize them by E on the handout. The evidence that there is a physical universe, that it's governed by simple laws of nature, that these laws are fine-tuned to produce humans, and humans are conscious beings. I'll explain fine-tuned in a moment. Now going to show you that my hypothesis explains very well those pieces of evidence. That is, that it satisfies my first criterion, that it is probable you would find E, these pieces of evidence, given H, the hypothesis of the existence of God, which I have described. God, on the hypothesis, is a very good God. He will want to bring about, to cause good things. We, human beings, are very good things. In particular, we have a kind of power which God himself does not have, the power to choose between good and evil. Us, God will want to create beings who can themselves be many creators and make a difference to the universe and each other. We are to make real differences to the universe. It must be possible for us to either make the universe better or make it worse. And if we are to make real differences to ourselves, we must be able to make us better or worse. If humans are to make such differences to the world and themselves, if humans are to make much difference to other humans, then they need bodies, because we can only get hold of each other and make differences to each other if there's a place where we can get hold of each other and make differences. And only physical things can occupy places. Have a body, I wouldn't know how to communicate with you or to benefit you or to hurt you. For us to exist, there needs to be a physical universe. We need to know how to benefit or harm others, and to know, therefore, how to make differences to the world and each other. Since we need to know that if we burn someone's crops, that will hurt them, and if we feed someone's crops, that will benefit them. If we are to know this, it must be the case that if we do some simple action with our bodies, that will make a difference to things further away. And Therefore, we have to know which motions of our hand will make which differences to other people and the world. Know that if I light a fire and burn the enemy's crops, that will hurt him. But if I water the enemy's crops, that will benefit him. Reason, there have to be simple regularities in the world which we can observe and so know what the effects of our actions will be. That is to say, there have to be simple laws of nature, because these regularities will only exist if the underlying laws of nature are simple ones. These laws need to be such as to keep our bodies in existence. What is valuable about humans is not merely their bodies, but that we are conscious beings, and therefore there have to be laws which have the consequence that bodies of a certain sort will be conscious. You'll see that what I have been arguing is that if H is true, and so God will want to make humans, it must be the case that there is a physical universe, that it is governed by simple laws of nature, that these laws of nature are such as to produce humans, and that humans are conscious. I've been arguing that my hypothesis that there is a God satisfies criterion 2 and criterion 1. So criterion 3 and criterion 1. I now go on to show that it satisfies criterion 2. If there were no God, it would be most unlikely that there is a physical universe. Even if there were a physical universe, nevertheless, if it is not made by God, there is not the slightest reason to suppose that it would be governed by simple laws rather than by complicated laws we can't understand, or by no laws at all. It has been recently discovered by scientists, and this is not a debatable matter, it's well known, that these laws are fine-tuned to produce intelligent life, including humans. This means, for example, there are 4 different kinds of laws of nature, and one of them is the gravitational law. There is a constant in the law, some number which has to have a very, very precise value if the law of gravity is to produce humans. Example, it has to have the number 32 in it, and it won't do if it had the number 32.0000000001 in it instead. And so, if there were no God, there is not the slightest reason to suppose that the laws would be fine-tuned to produce us. And if we are to exist, we must be conscious beings, but the physical laws do not explain that. And so there would need to be other laws which explain why we are conscious, and they would need to be very special and particular laws. That if there were no God, it is immensely improbable that we would find the evidence I described. For this reason, I argue that my hypothesis that there is a God is made very probable on the evidence which I have described, because it satisfies very well the 3 criteria which I have stated. So I think I have given you my answers to the first group of questions, the second group of questions, and the group of questions about the nature of God. And you are welcome to ask me questions if you wish.
First of all, Dr. Swinburne, thank you so much, to be with us. I don't know how much more time you want, but from now on, there will be no translation. It's going to be only for the English speaking people. So I know that Vasile has a question. I'm going to unmute everybody right now. And Vasile has the first question, and we appreciate very much for you being with us. Vasile.
Hello, Professor Swinburne.
Hello.
My question for the first part, when you mentioned the personal explanation compared to
Yes.
the scientific one. You said that we can identify it by the its simplicity by the lesser of properties. Like, for example, if one person has postulates less properties and another one postulates more properties, then the one with less properties will be the simplest one. So
Yes.
my question is, can one property itself be more complicated than 5 properties of another person, let's say? How can we judge then the simplicity?
Oh, well, I mean, take a simple example of a personal explanation. Suppose there has been a robbery. Some money has been taken from a safe, and the detective has 3 pieces of evidence. He has the evidence that a certain suspect, John, was near the scene of the crime at the time it was committed, that John's fingerprints were on the safe, and the money stolen from the safe was of the same value as money found in John's house. Now, we would think that is a good explanation of these. There was a good explanation of these phenomena, that John did the crime. But a defending lawyer could say, oh no, these 3 pieces of evidence were produced by entirely different people. One person dressed up like John to look like him at the scene of the crime. Another person put John's fingerprints on the safe without collusion with the first person, and another person hid money in John's house, coincidentally of the same amount. Now, you have put forward, I have put forward, or a defending lawyer has put forward, a hypothesis of 3 people doing the crime as opposed to 1, and these 3 people each have different properties from each other and different purposes which they are seeking to produce. I mean, if they were all seeking to produce the same, if they all were in collusion and were seeking to produce the same effect, then there would still be 3 persons, but their purpose would be the same, different. But in this case, the purposes are different. So this rival hypothesis is immensely improbable because it postulates more properties and more people. I only postulate 1 property for one substance, God, and 1 property, omnipotence, which is eternal in the sense of lasting forever and essential to the deity.
Vasily, you have the second question, I believe, about God being atemporal. Am I right?
Yeah, but I think
yes, we'll ask if no one else has a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, ask.
Go ahead, Vasily.
So my question, I think it was from the questions I sent via email. It's how do you reconcile your view of God being temporal with the Christian tradition, which all believed he was in the, let's say, eternal now, how Boetius described him, or let's say Thomas d'Aquino, they all believed, Augustine as well, they all believe like God is completely eternal and he is not in time, is not temporal.
That has certainly been the medieval view, but I think it only entered Christianity with Origen as the first person to say that at the beginning of the 3rd century. It wasn't heard of before then. It came from Plato, this idea, who thought that the eternal things were outside time. And not everybody in the later tradition accepted that God was outside time. And in particular, the theologian who has most influenced later Orthodox thought did not think that, and that was Gregory Palamas. Gregory Palamas said, God is temporal. We know God is, in a sense, in this sense, temporal, because it is said in the Bible that he created in 7 days, first this, then that, then the other. That showed us that God did things, one thing one day, another thing another day. And if you look at scripture, there are innumerable quotations which imply he did one thing one day and something else another day. And that was a notion entirely unknown to any of the authors of the Bible.
Thank you.
Maria, do you want to ask directly about your question? So there is a question from
I need
one
to
of
translate.
you. You want me to do it, or you want to do it?
You, please.
Okay. So the question is, Dr. Swinburne, is that a different kind of fine-tuning will result in a different universe. Can this hypothesis contradict too? It is possible if there is no H?
It would lead to a different universe, but it would not be a universe in which there are intelligent beings. This is a well-known scientific result. And my hypothesis has the consequence that God is quite likely to make intelligent beings, because he is perfectly good and would want to create a kind of goodness which he doesn't have. So it's not probable that he would create a universe. I mean, it's not probable. It is probable that he would create a universe like ours. That is my answer.
Another student is asking, why does the fine-tuning of the universe with such capabilities that in the future will provide the possibility of life inevitable involves the intervention of an intelligent mind?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that. Could you say again?
It says, why does the fine-tuning of the universe inevitably involve the intervention of the intelligent mind?
It doesn't involve in intervention. He made the laws from the beginning that way, so that we would evolve.
Can I ask one more question on this subject, if it's possible?
Unless anyone else has questions, yes.
I don't see any question there, but if it's possible, I would be.
In that case, go on.
All right. So regarding the fine tuning, I was having discussions with different people about the constants. And one question I had is, how do we know that these constants could have been different? Let's suppose that that's just a brute fact and they cannot be different. How do we know that they actually can be different? Since whatever we do, we just model mathematical models, but no one actually saw something changing in the universe. How would you respond to this?
Well, the mathematical physicists have worked out the consequences of different universes, and they have shown that you wouldn't get, in most of them, you wouldn't get atoms at all. If you did get atoms, they wouldn't be the complicated sort of atoms that are needed for us. In other words, atoms with large numbers of protons. If you did get these, they would be unlikely to combine in the way that would, in fact, give rise to life. I'm no expert on this, but this is a generally accepted result. If you alter them slightly, you just get chaos. Well, not chaos, but things behave regularly, but you don't get us. This isn't a disputed result in any way. I mean, there are ways of attempting to escape it. You may have heard of the idea of a multiverse.
Right.
Some scientists have put forward the idea that there is a multiverse. That's to say, a super universe consisting of many different universes, or rather, at the beginning, there was a sort of primeval soup which threw up different universes with different constants, different laws of nature, and different constants, right? And they say, well, if there are enough, if the universe has been going on long enough and throwing up different universes in different places, it's not unlikely that a universe like ours would turn up. Well, the problem there is that it would have to be a special sort of multiverse for this to happen. It would have to have particular sorts of laws, because it's easy to divide multiverses which don't throw up anywhere universes which are fine-tuned for life. At any rate, another difficulty is no scientist has succeeded in producing any plausible theory of what any multiverse would be like.
Yeah, usually they combine this with anthropic principle. I saw scientists like they say we have possibility of multiverse, and anthropic principle combined with this, it makes it plausible, they say, but I don't know what to say about that.
Well, you can have my information is from those who devise these things that although you can produce a hypothesis which has the character of a multiverse, it's a very complicated hypothesis. It doesn't satisfy my simplicity criterion. Now, some marvelous scientists may manage one day to produce one that does. But if they do, the problem then is it would be governed, the multiverse itself would be governed by simple laws about which universes they would throw up. And the question, therefore, is why is there a multiverse of this sort rather than a universe that throws up all sorts of, etc., throws up nothing but non-human type universes?
Dr. Swinburne, I have one more question. I don't know if you have time, but it's a more personal question.
Yes.
It's a personal question. So what drew you to God? Because it's a big difference between knowing about God and knowing God. In your case, what drew you to God? What was that point in your life and says, yes?
Well, I have always believed that there's a God. No doubt somebody told me this when I was young, and I believed them. But in the course of time, I came to think we need arguments for this. The secular world is beginning to doubt it. It's not an essential, it's not an item of knowledge taken for granted. We need arguments. So I looked for arguments. But I have always been a believer, though my reasons for believing have changed significantly. I don't know if that answers your question.
No. Thank you so much for your honesty. We've been interviewing, quite a bit of scientists lately, and it's mind-boggling when you see people that devote their life in the science and trying to find the answers. And they said, yes, the probability of a God existence is there, and I believe it. And then you got those that, they talk about it, but they don't know him. So that makes the difference. That's why I appreciate very much your answer and you coming in to talk to us.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you for inviting me.
And God bless you. God bless your family and your activities.
Thank you, and you and yours.
Thank you.